Okay, welcome to our lesson today on Frankenstein. And today our learning goal is to explain how Shelley incorporates the horror and romantic style of writing in her novel while also representing political and social change and conflict. So political and social change and conflict are basically straight from the rubric for Worlds of Upheaval, and looking at that broader world that Shelley is part of as an author, and how she represents her world in conflict in the conflict within her novel. So her world in conflict, she's looking at the clash between Enlightenment and rationalism with romantic values. So that's going to be our focus today. And I'm going to take you through looking at some of the extracts from Frankenstein. Okay, so the first page we're looking at is page 76, as you can see here. I want to focus on down the bottom of the page. So one of the things I want to talk today about is how Shelley uses the romantic form, how through her language and through the form of her novel, she uses these romantic values in the way that she writes. One of them is obviously the focus of nature, that we see that nature and we see that being important in the relationship Walton has with his discovery, that nature is so much part of that. And then we also see that through the relationship that Frankenstein has with his home country, with the nature that surrounds the mountains from where he's from, the part of Geneva that he's from. And then we also have that in the monster, because he finds the hovel and he finds that little cottage, and nature is the only place where he feels a sense of solace and comfort and unity and peace with nature. He sees beauty in nature, similar to that of Walton and Frankenstein. So we see all of those characteristics being mirrored, and their relationship with nature being an expression of how they're feeling at certain times in the novel. So on page 76 here at the bottom, we have this description. This is before the death of William. It's after Henry has come to rescue Frankenstein after the horror that his creation bestows upon him, and so he's recovering, and we see on page 76 that he has recovered at this point. And he talks about how he was happy, and inanimate nature had the power of bestowing on me the most delightful sensations. Serene sky and verdant fields filled me with ecstasy. And one of the things that romantics also focus on in their writing is the extremity of emotion. And so this idea of ecstasy being achievable through his exploration and relationship with nature is something that the romantics wanted to explore. And that's why we also see we have both ends of the spectrum of emotion and feeling. So we have ecstasy here and that delight and that positive sensation, but then we also later at other times in the novel we see the horror and the depths of despair. So they explore Shelley fits into the romantic style there by exploring the full range of emotions. Here we have nature being representative of joy, peace, a place to seek comfort and solace for Frankenstein. And that becomes a repetitive motif after intervals of horror and shock and suffering. Nature has this healing power, or this power for him to escape those horrors and have these moments of great peace. And so that becomes a motif that's repeated throughout Shelley's writing, and we see that, and I'll point that out later through the lesson. So we also, moving on to the next page, so page 77, here Frankenstein, records, or Shelley records, how Henry rejoiced in Frankenstein being revived and in his gaiety, and sincerely sympathized in my feelings. He exerted himself to amuse me, while he expressed the sensations that filled his soul. It talks about how his conversations were full of imagination, and he invented tales of wonderful fancy and passion. At other times, he repeated my favourite poems or drew me out into arguments, which he supported with great ingenuity. We also see that his spirits, Frankenstein's spirits, were high, and he bounded along with feelings of unbridled joy and hilarity. So one of the things we also see Shelley really exploring is this idea of nature being able to bring peace and bring satisfaction and joy. But then she also has that through relationship. And so we see this in Henry's relationship in the way that he restores Frankenstein to health. We also see Elizabeth at other points throughout the novel doing that as well. We also see this in the relationship of the De Lacy family that the monster observes. We see that they have endured sufferings, and yet together their relationship and their sense of duty, and domestic duty in particular, means that Felix and Safie, they all experience joy through that drawing each other out, through that investing in one another. And this is one of those moments where I think Shelley really is looking at what's happening and the conflict in her world with the influence of industrialization starting to play a part, and that focus being taken off the relationships and the individuals, and the romantics were trying to revive that. And I think that Shelley is exploring that. She does explore this conflict between duty and ambition. And so it's really significant that Shelley has nature representative of bringing peace, but also relationship, domestic relationship. And that's what Henry fulfills here. And remember that Henry acts as a foil to Frankenstein. So think about that. Think about how Henry is this, fits this role of bringing Frankenstein's spirits, uplifting him and providing him with joy and gaiety. But we see, think about how that acts as a foil to Frankenstein. What does Frankenstein bring to his relationships? What does he bring to the world? And that's where I think the Promethean myth is relevant from last lesson. That idea about, well, he has sought to bring things to the world through ambition and through creation, but has a really different result. So I want you to be thinking about that too, and the differences there. Okay, this is also a bit, this is a bit of the calm before the storm. So they're happy and gay after the depression and sickness and suffering that Frankenstein experienced with the awakening of the monster. But now we're about to be plunged again into suffering with the death of William. So this next page that I'll get you to look at is page 83. And this is where Henry is talking about how Frankenstein's received the letter that William has died. Henry's description of how a murderer could destroy such radiant innocence. We've got a real contrast there between the innocence of William, Frankenstein's younger brother, and then the evil nature of whoever has murdered him. And at this point, no one knows who has murdered William, and Frankenstein receives the letter and immediately goes. And this is Henry talks to him on their way to get the horses to go. But it does foreshadow this Promethean suffering that we see Frankenstein endure the whole way through the novel, that he never really finds peace and solace, never finds that comfort because of the destruction of his creation. So this, moving on to page 84, or I think this is actually page 83, he's on his way home now. He talks about how he feels when he arrives in Geneva. The town's quiet and at peace, but he's not able to rest. He resolves to visit the spot where his poor William had been murdered. And so that's what we see him enter out into nature. And as he does that, a really significant technique by Shelley has been used here. She uses this throughout her novel. It's part of her form, is the use of pathetic fallacy. So the way that the weather reflects often the inner turmoil and conflict within the characters. So here we know that Frankenstein isn't able to rest because of the death of his brother. And so a storm appears and approaches rapidly, and it's described as violent. The heavens were clouded, and rain coming slowly down in drops. It talks about the pitchy darkness, and then on the next page, it's at the top, but it again talks about the violence of the storm. And so this really reflects Frankenstein's mood at this point and how he's feeling. Again, on page, I think that I'm just going to go back here because I thought there was a quote I wanted to focus on. Yes, at the top, it's actually just been cut off. I'm going to see if I can go down. Here it is. So here, this is a prophecy and an epiphany of Frankenstein. He foresees obscurely that I was destined to become the most wretched of human beings. And doesn't that just link back to our lesson on the modern Prometheus yesterday, that Shelley is really exploring that, how Prometheus was endured and made to suffer by Zeus for his creation and for the mistake that Zeus perceives he made in creation. And we see Shelley has romantically and cautiously made Frankenstein representative of that suffering too. So he's predicting that. And he prophesied truly and failed in only one single circumstance, that in all the misery I imagined and dreaded, I did not conceive 1/100th the part of anguish I was destined to endure. So that's retrospective. That's Franklin as he tells Walton. Retrospectively, he's admitting that he did prophesy his suffering, but he couldn't have imagined at the time just how bad it was. So that retrospective perspective that we see here in moments throughout, throughout the middle part of our novel, when it's Frankenstein's voice, we really see that he is using this as a warning to Walton, and also Shelley, therefore, is using that as a warning to her readers, that we can't, when we mess with the order of things, when we mess with the divine order of life, that we can't imagine how much suffering and pain is going to be unleashed upon us. Okay. I'm just going to stop that there now, and I'll start another one in a minute. After this, I'm going to get you to answer some questions and put this down in some notes, particularly draw out some of these really key quotes and put it into a piece of writing so that you have that as something to go back and reflect on. Okay, thanks for listening.